Margaret walked into the luxurious hotel lobby, her steps steady but unhurried. She looked every bit the part of someone who didn't belong. Her clothes were modest, simple, and her wrinkled face told stories of decades lived with little more than the bare necessities. She had no grand jewelry to sparkle in the light, no designer handbag to flaunt. Her shoes, worn from years of use, creaked lightly as she moved. She made her way to the front desk, her eyes scanning the lobby as she approached. At the reception, Richard, the hotel manager, glanced up from his phone. His eyes flickered briefly to Margaret before looking away, dismissing her with a glance. He was used to seeing wealth, the kind of wealth that came in shiny cars, tailored suits, and polished appearances. People like Margaret, well, they didn't belong here. She reached the counter and smiled politely at him. "I'd like to book a room," she said, her voice calm and steady. Richard barely looked at her, already dismissing her. "We're fully booked," he said coldly, not even bothering to lift his gaze. "Perhaps you should try somewhere more suitable for someone like you." Margaret, taken aback for a moment, simply nodded, her smile never fading. "Thank you for your time," she said, turning to leave. But as she did, she paused and added softly, "It's funny how life works, isn't it?" Richard didn't respond. He was already distracted by the sight of a wealthy guest entering the lobby, his expensive suit drawing Richard's full attention. The moment the man approached, Richard greeted him with a smile, ready to shower him with the kind of attention Margaret had been denied. As Margaret stepped outside, she pulled out her phone and dialed a number. The call was answered almost immediately. "Henry, it's time." The next day, Richard couldn't stop smiling. He had just received confirmation that a high-profile client was arriving, someone who would guarantee his promotion if all went well. The hotel was abuzz with excitement, staff scrambling to prepare for the distinguished guest who would be staying in the penthouse suite. Richard, however, had no time to worry about anything other than his promotion. He felt confident. After all, he had been doing this job for years, and his hard work was about to pay off. As he straightened his tie, he couldn't help but chuckle to himself. Yesterday's encounter with the old woman, Margaret, was nothing more than a distant memory. She was nothing more than a nuisance, someone who didn't belong in his world. Margaret's words, "It's funny how life works," lingered in his mind, but he quickly brushed them aside. Who cared about her? She didn't matter. She had no power, no wealth. People like her came and went all the time. The ones who mattered were the ones who could afford the high-end rooms, the ones who drove luxury cars, the ones who made his life easier. Meanwhile, in the quiet corners of the hotel, Emma, the receptionist who had tried to help Margaret the day before, sat at her desk. She couldn't stop thinking about the old woman. Something about her felt different. It wasn't just the way she had spoken, so calm and collected despite being humiliated. There was a quiet strength about her, something that stuck with Emma long after she had left the hotel. On a whim, Emma decided to search Margaret's name online. What she found stopped her in her tracks. Margaret Carter. The name alone sent chills down her spine. It wasn't just a common name. It was the name of a real estate mogul, one of the wealthiest women in the world. She was the owner of the very hotel chain Richard worked for, and a number of other high-end properties around the globe. Emma's breath caught in her throat. The woman who had been humiliated by Richard yesterday wasn't just some poor old lady. She was the mother of one of the most powerful businessmen in the world. Emma sat frozen, staring at the screen. How could she have not known? How could Richard, the manager, not know? He had treated her like dirt, dismissing her as if she were nothing. And now Emma realized that this woman had been everything. As Emma sat there, her thoughts racing, she decided she had to warn Richard. She picked up the phone and dialed his number. "Richard, you need to listen to me. I just found out who Margaret really is. The morning arrived, and Richard was too busy basking in his own excitement to think much about the call Emma had tried to make. He hadn't answered it, dismissing it as a random concern. After all, he had bigger things to worry about today. The big client was arriving, and everything needed to be perfect. There was no time for distractions, especially not from a receptionist. As Richard paced around the hotel lobby, checking every corner and making sure all the arrangements were perfect, Emma's words from the previous day started to feel like they were haunting him. She had tried to warn him, tried to tell him about Margaret, but he'd brushed her off. He was too focused on the upcoming meeting, too obsessed with the idea of finally being recognized for all his hard work. Then, the first luxury car rolled up to the entrance. It wasn't the car he had been expecting. There were no sleek sports cars or private jets to match the big client he was supposed to impress. This car was different. It was understated, but there was something about it that screamed wealth. The driver stepped out and opened the door, but it was who stepped out next that made Richard's heart stop. A man in his mid-30s, sharply dressed in a designer suit, walked towards the lobby with an air of authority. He wasn't carrying a briefcase, nor did he seem to be in a rush. The moment his eyes met Richard's, Richard froze. The man smiled politely, his presence commanding respect. "Good morning," he said, his voice calm and confident. "I'm looking for my mother, Margaret Carter. Is she here?" Richard's blood ran cold. He'd seen the name Carter somewhere before. His mind scrambled as he tried to place it, but before he could speak, the man continued. "I assume you know who I am," he added, raising an eyebrow. Richard's stomach sank as it hit him. This was Henry Carter, the son of the woman he had humiliated the day before. Margaret's son, the heir to the empire that Richard had worked for. The man whose family owned the hotel chain he worked at. Richard felt a wave of panic rush over him. His mind raced, trying to find a way to recover from his actions. What had he done? He had treated the mother of this man like an insignificant nobody, and now the very person who could decide his future was standing right in front of him. Henry didn't seem to be bothered by Richard's obvious discomfort. He remained calm, almost as if he were waiting for Richard to say something. "I'd like to speak with my mother," Henry said again, his tone still polite but firm. "Do you know where she is?" Richard stammered, suddenly unsure of himself. He quickly glanced around, looking for an escape, but the lobby was crowded, and there was nowhere to hide from the reality of what was about to unfold. He cleared his throat, attempting to regain his composure. "I'll check the system, Mr. Carter. Please give me a moment," Richard said, though his voice lacked the confidence it had just moments ago. Henry nodded, still calm, still composed. As Richard fumbled with his computer, trying to locate any information on Margaret's supposed reservation, the door swung open again, and the last person Richard expected to see walked into the hotel. Margaret. She wasn't dressed in the plain clothes she had worn yesterday. She stood tall, exuding an aura of authority that immediately commanded the attention of everyone in the room. The quiet, humble woman who had been dismissed yesterday was gone. In her place stood the woman who owned this empire. Richard couldn't breathe. He watched, paralyzed, as Margaret walked towards the desk. Henry by her side, a smile on his face. "I hope you're well, Richard," Margaret said calmly, her eyes piercing through him. She didn't look angry, but there was something in her gaze that made Richard feel like the walls were closing in on him. "I hope you've been treating your guests well." Richard could barely speak. His mouth was dry and his palms began to sweat. This couldn't be happening. Not to him. He had worked so hard for this promotion, and now it was all crumbling around him. I'm sorry," Richard stuttered, finally finding his voice. "I didn't realize who you were yesterday, Mrs. Carter." Margaret held up a hand, silencing him. "You didn't recognize me, but you did recognize Henry, didn't you?" Richard swallowed hard, his face flushing with embarrassment. "I didn't mean to—" "No," Margaret said, cutting him off. "You didn't mean to disrespect me, but you did. You humiliated me in front of everyone here. You assumed I didn't belong simply because of the way I looked. And now you're standing here in front of me with no apology, no recognition of your mistake." Richard's heart raced. He could hear the pounding of his own heartbeat in his ears. This was it, the moment he had been dreading. "Henry," Margaret said, turning to her son, "I think it's time for Richard to understand exactly who he's been dealing with." Henry didn't say anything. He simply watched as his mother calmly addressed Richard. "Richard," she said slowly, her voice dripping with calm authority, "you've made a huge mistake, and I want you to understand the gravity of it. You've insulted the one person who holds the keys to this empire. You've disrespected someone who could have been your greatest ally. And now, you're going to learn what it means to cross the line." Richard's face turned white as the reality of his mistake set in. He had treated Margaret like nothing, assuming she was just another poor, helpless old woman. But now he was face to face with the truth. The woman he had so carelessly insulted wasn't just anybody. She was the one person who had the power to change everything for him. Margaret smiled softly at him, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who knew exactly what was coming next. "You've got two choices," she said. "You can apologize, and perhaps I'll consider letting you keep your job. Or you can leave, and I'll make sure everyone in this hotel knows exactly what kind of person you are." Richard stood frozen, unable to move. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, and he realized, for the first time in his life, just how small and insignificant he really was in the grand scheme of things. Richard could hardly breathe. The weight of his mistake pressed down on him like 1,000 tons. Standing before him was the woman who had every right to destroy him, Margaret Carter, the owner of the very hotel chain that had given him his job, and beside her, her son Henry, who had clearly inherited the same power and authority that his mother exuded so effortlessly. Richard was now acutely aware that everything he had worked for was hanging by a thread. Margaret's words echoed in his mind. "You've made a huge mistake." Richard wanted to apologize. He wanted to beg for forgiveness, to explain that it was a moment of arrogance, of complete ignorance. But the words caught in his throat. He knew it wouldn't be enough. The damage had already been done, and there was nothing he could do to undo the humiliation he had caused. "You've got two choices," Margaret's voice cut through his thoughts like a knife. "You can apologize, and perhaps I'll consider letting you keep your job. Or you can leave, and I'll make sure everyone in this hotel knows exactly what kind of person you are." Richard's mind raced. He wanted to take the first option, to beg and plead, to show that he could change. But his pride, his ego, had been so deeply wounded that it made him hesitate. He had spent years building up his reputation in the hotel industry, and now, in one moment of judgment, It was all slipping through his fingers. The thought of walking away from it all was unbearable. Margaret saw his internal struggle and smiled, but it wasn't a smile of kindness. It was a smile that conveyed understanding, the understanding that Richard was facing the consequences of his own hubris. She knew exactly what he was going through. "You think this is just about the hotel, don't you?" she asked, her voice calm, measured. "You think that all of this is just about you and your job, but it's not. It's about something much bigger." Richard looked at her, confused, unsure where this conversation was headed. "What do you mean?" he finally managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. Margaret's gaze softened, but there was no mistaking the power in her words. "You assumed I was insignificant. You thought I was just another old woman, someone you could dismiss without a second thought. But I am not just another person, Richard. I am the person who makes decisions. I am the one who shapes the world around you. And now, you're going to learn what happens when you make assumptions about people based on their appearance or their age." Richard swallowed hard, his throat dry. He wanted to speak, to explain, but the words wouldn't come. His mind was too clouded with the shame of his actions. All he could do was stand there, trying to find a way to make things right. Henry, who had been silently observing the interaction between his mother and Richard, finally spoke up. "You're lucky, Richard," he said, his voice calm but with an edge of authority. "Most people would have been fired on the spot for treating my mother like that. But my mother believes in second chances. She believes that people can learn from their mistakes." Richard's head shot up. He looked at Henry, surprised by his words. "Second chances?" he repeated, disbelief creeping into his voice. "Yes," Henry said firmly. "But they come at a cost. You're going to have to prove that you're worthy of that second chance. You're going to have to show that you've learned something from this. Otherwise, you won't be walking out of here with a job today." Richard felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He knew that the next few moments would determine everything. His future, his career, was on the line. Margaret stepped forward, placing a hand on Henry's arm as if to steady herself. "I'll give you a chance, Richard," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. "But I'm going to make sure you never forget this moment. You're going to work hard, and you're going to prove to me, and to yourself, that you deserve to be here." Richard nodded quickly, desperate to redeem himself. "I'll do anything, Mrs. Carter. Anything. I swear. Please give me the chance." Margaret's eyes narrowed as she studied him for a moment. "You've got one chance, Richard. One chance to make things right. And if you fail, if you make another mistake, I'll make sure everyone knows what kind of man you really are." The weight of her words hit Richard like a ton of bricks. He had no choice but to accept her offer. He had no choice but to prove that he was worthy of the position he had worked so hard to attain. With a final penetrating glance, Margaret turned to Henry. "Let's go, Henry. We have work to do." Henry gave Richard a polite nod before following his mother toward the elevators. Richard stood there, still reeling from everything that had just happened. He had narrowly escaped disaster, but the price of his salvation was steep. As he stood there, alone in the hotel lobby, Richard couldn't help but reflect on what had just occurred. He realized that this moment, this encounter with Margaret, had been a wake-up call. It had shattered his illusions about power, status, and the people he had always thought were beneath him. He had treated Margaret like nothing, assuming she was just an old woman who didn't belong. But now, he saw the truth. Margaret was the person who controlled everything, the person who had built an empire from the ground up, and he, Richard, had been nothing more than a pawn in her world. Richard took a deep breath, his mind now clear. He knew what he had to do. He had to prove that he wasn't the arrogant, dismissive man he had once been. He had to prove that he could learn from his mistakes and rise above them. This was his chance, a chance he couldn't afford to waste. The next few weeks were the hardest of Richard's life. Every day he worked tirelessly, showing up early, staying late, doing whatever it took to prove that he was worthy of Margaret's second chance. He learned to treat everyone with respect, to listen more and speak less, and to put the needs of the hotel and its guests above his own ego. As time passed, Richard's reputation began to change. The staff began to see him in a new light. They saw someone who was willing to work hard, someone who was willing to make amends for his past mistakes. And slowly but surely, Richard earned back their trust. Then, one fateful day, Margaret came into the hotel again. Richard was prepared. He had worked tirelessly to make sure everything was perfect. He had earned her trust, but this was his ultimate test. Margaret walked into the lobby, her presence filling the room. She looked around, taking in the changes that Richard had made. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Margaret broke the silence. "I'm proud of you, Richard," she said, her voice steady but warm. "You've done exactly what I asked. You've proven that you can learn from your mistakes, and for that, I'm willing to offer you something more." Richard stood tall, his heart racing. "Anything, Mrs. Carter. I'll keep working hard. I'll keep doing whatever it takes." Margaret nodded, a smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "You've earned your place here, Richard, and I'm willing to give you more responsibility. You're ready for the next step in your career." Richard couldn't believe what he was hearing. After everything that had happened, after everything he had learned, he was finally being given the opportunity he had worked for. But more than that, he had learned the most important lesson of all: humility. Margaret had given him more than a second chance. She had given him a lesson in life that would stay with him forever.